Welcome back to The Explainer. We are jumping right into it today because we're tackling one of the most fascinating, yet honestly kind of misunderstood sectors in the entire healthcare industry. You know, when we hear the word pharma, we almost always picture scientists in lab coats, massive billion-dollar research budgets, and groundbreaking new cures. But there's this massive parallel universe operating right alongside it, generic pharma. Consider this. Generics make up about 90% of the medications in your medicine cabinet right now, but they only account for around 18% of total drug spending. It's a totally different game with completely different rules, and it is driven almost entirely by ruthless execution rather than flashy innovation.
And that brings us to the ultimate paradox of the industry, doesn't it? Generic drugs are famous for basically one thing above all else, being incredibly cheap. We see it at the pharmacy counter every single day. A branded drug might cost you hundreds of dollars, while its generic equivalent costs practically nothing by comparison. So you might be wondering, if your main product is famous for having a rock-bottom price, how on earth do you build a multi-billion-dollar business around it? How does a company actually survive, let alone thrive, in that kind of environment?
Well, let's unpack that in our first section, the generic drug paradox.
To really grasp this paradox, we have to look at the timing. Fundamentally, a generic drug is a version of a medicine that perfectly matches the original brand's active ingredient and its therapeutic performance. But here's the catch. Therapeutically identical definitely does not mean commercially identical. The absolute crucial phrase here is after the original product's exclusivity period ends. See, the original company gets a window of protection through patents and regulatory exclusivity to make back their massive investment. But for a generic company, the commercial story doesn't even begin until that exclusivity vanishes. That moment is the starting gun. That's when the doors fly open, regulatory approvals get handed out to competitors, and the real brawl begins.
It helps to look at them side by side. Innovative pharma carries this unbelievably high research and development burden. They're spending billions, facing massive clinical risks, just to discover and prove an entirely new medicine from scratch. And because they take on that wild risk, they get exclusivity protection, which lets them command a high price. On the flip side, generic pharma doesn't bear that discovery risk. Actually, their R&D burden is remarkably low by comparison. They aren't trying to invent a new molecule. They're just figuring out how to manufacture an existing one flawlessly. But because they don't have that exclusivity shield, they face immediate, intense price competition. So they have to become incredibly execution-heavy and rely entirely on high volume. It is just an entirely different commercial DNA.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 2, Life After Exclusivity. Think of the life cycle of a modern medicine in 4 distinct phases. For years, you have Phase 1, the innovator exclusivity phase. High prices, a completely protected market. Then we hit Step 2, patent expiry. In the industry, this is known as LOE, or loss of exclusivity. This is day 0. Almost immediately, in Step 3, we see the very first generic entry. Now the original brand finally has a direct competitor and prices start to slip. But then we hit Step 4, and this is where the floodgates open. Multiple competitors enter the fray. The market goes from a monopoly to a 2-player game to a completely commoditized bloodbath with 5, 10, or maybe even more companies selling the exact same molecule. And when everyone is selling virtually identical products, price becomes your biggest and sometimes your only competitive weapon. That flood of competitors inevitably crashes the market price.
So, let's figure out how they survived that crash in Section 3, the for-profit levers.
It all comes down to this ruthless, beautifully simple equation. Lower price multiplied by large volume equals meaningful revenue. You might literally only be making pennies on the pill, but if you are moving hundreds of millions of pills, well, those pennies become millions of dollars. Moving a staggering number of prescriptions is the absolute engine of survival here. The math forces this intense inverse relationship. Your price per unit is astonishingly low compared to the original brand, so you have to trade unit margin for sheer, overwhelming scale. Like we said, you might be making fractions of a penny on a single pill, but when you sell a billion pills, you build an empire. This is exactly why generics make up the vast majority of prescriptions actually dispensed to patients globally. So, to pull off this massive balancing act, generic companies pull 4 distinct profit levers. First, as we just discussed, is high volume. You need incredibly wide channel access and distribution just to move the product. Second is efficient manufacturing. When your price is that low, your cost of goods sold is literally public enemy number 1. If a company can control manufacturing costs better than their competitors while maintaining strict quality, they protect their margins. Third, Timing of entry. It is a dead sprint. The earlier you get in after that loss of exclusivity, the better. And finally, portfolio scale. Generic pharma is not a single blockbuster drug model. You do not build a generic company around one single molecule. You build a massive portfolio of dozens or even hundreds of molecules across all sorts of dosages and markets to spread your risk and create massive scale benefits in procurement and sales.
Which brings up a great question for Section 4. Who makes the most?
So who takes home the lion's share of the profits in this commoditized space? The absolute best economics come from a few very specific scenarios. First up, early entrants. If you are the very first generic to hit the market, you might only be competing against the original brand for a few months. Prices haven't cratered yet, so your margins for that brief window are fantastic. Second, limited competition products. Sometimes a drug just requires a really specialized manufacturing process which naturally limits how many companies can actually pull it off. Third, complex generics. We're not just talking about simple tablets or capsules here. We're talking injectables, inhalers, complex formulations. The harder it is to make, the fewer competitors you have breathing down your neck. And lastly, large, efficient operators. Companies with rock-solid supply reliability, flawless regulatory compliance, and a massive global footprint, they just outcompete the smaller players over time.
But of course, it's not all easy money. Let's look at the dark side in Section 5, Risks in the System.
Because this is an execution-heavy model, we really need to highlight the threats that keep generic pharma executives awake at night. The biggest one is price erosion and margin compression. Imagine this. Constant inflation rises. Say your raw materials suddenly get way more expensive, but the market price continues to drop because it's an overcrowded market. Your margins get completely squeezed out of existence. Then there are regulatory and quality issues. A sudden regulatory warning letter from a health agency can entirely halt a company's manufacturing and supply chain literally overnight. And, as we've all seen globally, supply chain disruptions, whether it's a shortage of active pharmaceutical ingredients or just a logistics nightmare, can instantly torpedo a company's performance. The generic pharma model severely punishes bad execution. There is zero room for error.
All right, let's bring it all together for our final section, the final takeaway.
When you weigh the timeline, the intense math, and the massive risks, it all boils down to this. Generic pharma equals scale plus timing plus execution. Winning in the generic drug business is not a scientific race to discover the next miracle cure. It is a relentless, highly disciplined game of operational excellence. It's about choosing the right products, getting them to market at exactly the right millisecond, manufacturing them at a fiercely controlled cost, and distributing them at a massive scale. It is a true marvel of modern business efficiency, and frankly, it's the engine that makes healthcare vastly more affordable for everyone.
And that wraps up our deep dive into the generic pharma business model. But as you know, this is just one piece of a much, much larger puzzle. So, what should we tackle next? Should we dive into the massive financial impacts of the patent cliff? Maybe do a granular breakdown of loss of exclusivity? Or pull back the curtain on how pharma licensing deals actually get negotiated in the boardroom? Let me know what you want to learn next. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and I will see you in the next explainer.